Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the ESS Guardian, watching the holographic display flicker with incoming data, and the Deep Space Patrol had been routine until 3 hours ago, when the distress signal pierced through the void like a cry in the darkness, and Lieutenant Amy Crawford sat at the communications station with her fingers dancing across the console as she isolated the signal and reported that they were receiving another burst transmission from the same coordinates, and the aliens were claiming critical life support failure, and their voices sounded desperate through the speakers. Jake leaned forward to study the alien script that their translation algorithms had deciphered, and the Velcrin were a species humanity had encountered only twice before, and both times had been through diplomatic channels at neutral stations, and they were traders and merchants who preferred profit over politics, and now one of their ships was supposedly dying in the void and calling for help from anyone who could hear them. Navigation Officer Chris Palmer checked his instruments and reported that the distress signal was coming from approximately 4 light hours from their current position, and if they pushed the engines hard enough, they could reach the location in 18 hours, and Jake rubbed his jaw while considering the situation carefully, because something about this felt wrong, but he could not put his finger on exactly what was bothering him. The Velcrin ship was identified as the merchant vessel called Prosperity's Dawn, and it had been transmitting increasingly desperate messages for the past 3 hours, and their life support systems were supposedly failing, and 17 crew members were dying, and they begged for immediate assistance from any ship in range, and their translators made their words sound urgent and afraid. Jake gave the order to respond and told Amy to send a message that they were coming, and to tell the Velcrin to hold on, and he ordered Chris to plot the fastest course possible, and he wanted maximum efficiency from the engines, because if people were really dying out there, then every minute counted, and the crew moved with practiced precision as they had done hundreds of times before. The Guardian's engines hummed louder as power surged through the system, and the ship accelerated toward the coordinates where the Velcrin vessel waited, and Jake stood at his station with an uneasy feeling settling in his gut, like a cold stone. And he had learned to trust his instincts over the years because they had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations. After 20 minutes of silence, Amy spoke up again and said that something was odd about the Velcrin transmission, and she had been analyzing the signal decay and propagation patterns, and the distress call was too clean and too perfect, and Jake turned to face her and asked what she meant by too clean, because that seemed like a strange thing to say about an emergency broadcast. Amy explained that when a ship was in a genuine emergency, especially one involving life support failure, you would expect to see power fluctuations in the signal, and there should be degradation in the transmission quality, and maybe even panic, evident in the voice patterns of whoever was sending the message, but this transmission was pristine and crystal clear, as if it had been recorded in optimal conditions with full power available. Jake's unease deepened like ice water flowing through his veins, and he told Amy to keep monitoring the signal and to let him know if anything else seemed off or unusual, and he wanted every detail analyzed because his gut was screaming that something was very wrong with this situation, even though he could not prove it yet. As the hours passed and the Guardian raced through space toward the coordinates, more peculiarities began to emerge from the data, and the Velcrin ship's trajectory did not match their claimed destination, and their emergency beacon had a broadcast strength that seemed excessive for a dying ship that should be conserving every bit of power, and the pieces were not adding up to a coherent picture. Amy ran the voice patterns through their analysis software and discovered something deeply troubling, and she reported that the voice in the distress call showed no stress markers at all, and there were no elevated heart rate indicators, and no respiratory distress, and whoever had recorded this message was calm and collected, and very much in control of themselves. Jake stood and walked to the viewport where he stared at the stars streaking past the ship, and humanity had learned hard lessons in its short time among the galactic community, and some species saw compassion as weakness, and others saw it as an opportunity to exploit, and he wondered if the Velcrin had decided that humans made easy targets. He made a decision and called out the order for battle stations, but told the crew not to power up weapons yet, because he wanted to see what they were walking into. But he also wanted to be ready for anything, and the crew exchanged glances, but moved swiftly to comply with his orders because they trusted their commander's judgment. Alarm lights switched from white to amber throughout the ship, and Marines assembled in the armory checking their weapons and armor, and gunners took their positions at dormant weapon controls, and everyone prepared for the possibility of combat, even though they were supposed to be on a rescue mission. Amy asked if he was sure about this because if the emergency was real and they approached with obvious hostility, it could cause a diplomatic incident. But Jake replied that if this was real, then the Velcrin would understand caution, and if it was not real, then they needed to be prepared for what was coming. 16 hours into their journey, the Guardian sensors detected the Velcrin ship, and it hung in space, dark and seemingly lifeless, like a corpse floating in the void. But the sensors told a very different story than what the eyes could see, and Chris reported that he was reading full power output from the vessel. The Velcrin reactor was at optimal capacity and running at full strength, and their life support was functioning perfectly with no signs of any malfunction, and Chris continued his report saying that he was detecting 17 life signs aboard. The ship and all of them were healthy with normal vital signs, and none of them were dying. Jake asked about weapons signatures, and Chris began a deep scan. And after a moment he confirmed the presence of multiple plasma cannons, and concealed missile tubes, and what looked like an electromagnetic pulse array, and he stated clearly that this was not a merchant vessel at all, but a warship pretending to be a civilian ship. Jake felt his suspicions crystallize into certainty, like ice forming on a window, and he ordered red alert and told the crew to power all weapons and raise shields to maximum strength. And Amy was told to open a communication channel because he wanted to give these aliens one chance to explain themselves. The bridge lights shifted to crimson, and the Guardian's weapon systems came online with a deep thrumming sound that resonated through the hull like the growl of a predator, and every crew member was now at full combat readiness and ready for whatever came next. Amy reported that the channel was open, and Jake's voice was cold as ice when he spoke, and he identified himself as Commander Jake Morrison of the Earth Space Service ship Guardian, and he told the Velcrin that they knew the distress call was fabricated, and they knew the ship was fully operational and armed, and they had 30 seconds to explain themselves before being treated as a hostile combatant. Silence stretched across the void for 29 long seconds, and everyone on the bridge held their breath, waiting to see what would happen, and then laughter erupted from the speakers, and it was cold and mocking and full of contempt for the humans who had come to help. A grating voice spoke in perfect English and said that humans were clever, and that the Velcrin had expected them to arrive blind and stupid and ready to be plucked like fruit from a tree. But the humans had teeth, and that was good because it would make things more entertaining for the hunters. The Velcrin ship's lights blazed to life in the darkness, and weapon ports opened like hungry mouths ready to devour their prey, and the voice continued speaking with mockery dripping from every word, saying that humans had come to save them, and asking how noble and how predictable it was that humanity's greatest weakness was dressed up as virtue. Jake's response was immediate and cold as he told them they had made a fatal miscalculation, and he gave the order to fire, and the Guardian's railguns spoke first with magnetic accelerators hurling tungsten projectiles at speeds that approached the speed of light, and the Velcrin ship's shields flared brightly as they absorbed the impacts. But the kinetic force made them buckle and strain. The enemy ship returned fire with plasma bolts that seared through space like burning meteors, and Jake commanded evasive maneuvers, and the Guardian twisted and rolled through the void with its momentum engines fighting against inertia to keep everyone alive, and the crew held onto their stations as the ship shook and vibrated from the violent movements. Jake ordered his gunners to target the weapon arrays specifically, and he commanded missiles away, and 6 missiles streaked from the Guardian's launch tubes, and the Velcrin attempted to shoot them down with their point defense systems, but 3 missiles got through the defensive fire and slammed into the warship's hull with brilliant explosions that scattered debris into the endless void. The Velcrin ship was larger and more heavily armed than the Guardian, but the human crew was smarter and more experienced, and another volley of plasma fire caught the Guardian's aft shields and overloaded 2 generators, and Amy reported that shields were down to 60% and the enemy was charging their electromagnetic pulse array. Jake said they would blind the Velcrin before that could happen, and he ordered the deployment of chaff and told them to launch the Hunter-Seeker missiles, and the Guardian released a massive cloud of reflective particles and electromagnetic noise, generators that confused and disrupted the enemy sensors. 6 smaller missiles with onboard targeting systems wove through the chaos and confusion, seeking heat signatures and power sources like bloodhounds following a scent, and 4 of them found their marks, and the Velcrin ship's sensor arrays exploded in cascading failures that left the warship effectively blind. The 5th Hunter-Seeker penetrated a weakened shield section and detonated inside a missile tube, and this triggered a sympathetic explosion that tore open the warship's flank like a knife cutting through soft flesh. and Chris reported that the enemy was venting atmosphere through multiple hull breaches, and their weapons were going offline one by one. Jake watched the crippled ship tumble slowly in space with fires visible through the gaping wounds in its hull, and he felt no satisfaction or joy in the victory, but only grim necessity because this had been a trap designed to kill people who came to help, and he told Amy to open a channel to the dying vessel. Static filled the bridge mixed with distant alarms and screaming voices, and Jake spoke clearly and coldly, telling them they had tried to exploit mercy, and they had thought compassion made humans weak, but they were wrong because humans help those who genuinely need it, but they destroy those who fake distress calls. He told them to consider this a lesson delivered to anyone else who thought they could prey on Earth's kindness and humanity's willingness to help strangers. And then he closed the channel and turned to Amy and told her to send a full report to Fleet Command with all sensor data and communication logs. Jake wanted to make sure that everyone understood. This was not a misunderstanding or an accident, but a deliberate attempted ambush designed to kill rescue vessels. And Amy confirmed the orders and began compiling the data, and Jake told her to send a second message broadcast on all known channels throughout the galaxy. He wanted every species to know what happened here, and he wanted them to know exactly what happens when someone tries to weaponize humanity's better nature and turn compassion into a trap. And the Guardian turned away from the dying Velcrin ship, leaving them to contemplate their mistake in the cold darkness. 3 days later, Admiral Helen Carter stood before a holographic display in Fleet Command's Strategic Operations Center, and she studied the data from the Guardian's encounter with deep concern, and around her analysts and officers worked at their stations compiling reports and cross-referencing intelligence from multiple sources. Captain Martin Hughes highlighted several points on the star map and explained that this was not an isolated incident, and they had identified 6 similar cases over the past 8 months, and these were distress calls that seemed questionable, and ships that responded to them were never heard from again. Helen asked how they had missed the pattern for so long, and Martin explained that the attacks were spread across a wide area, involving different species and different circumstances, and until now, no one had realized they were connected by a common thread. He pulled up incident reports and listed the names of missing vessels, including the merchant ship Stellar Dawn, that was last seen responding to a distress call near the Tertian Nebula, and the science vessel Discovery that disappeared after diverting to assist what they believed was a colony in trouble. The list continued with the transport Regina, and the frigate Valiant, and the civilian yacht Wanderer, and all of them were gone without a trace. And Helen asked quietly how many people were confirmed dead or missing, and Martin replied that the number was 412 souls. The number hung in the air like a physical weight pressing down on everyone in the room, and Helen had spent 30 years in the service rising through the ranks by being smarter and more prepared than her adversaries. But this was different because this enemy had weaponized the very thing that made humanity worth defending. Intelligence Officer Lisa Grant stepped forward with her tablet and explained that the Guardians' encounter gave them their first solid evidence, but based on debris recovered from 2 other attack sites, they were seeing weapon signatures that matched Velcrin technology, and the aliens might be working alone, or they might be part of a larger operation. Helen asked what they knew about Velcrin space capabilities, and Lisa reported that the aliens had approximately 75 warships disguised as civilian vessels scattered across 5 sectors, and their government officially claimed they were a peaceful trading confederation. But intelligence suggested they had been conducting piracy operations for years. Martin pointed out that the Velcrin had never targeted humans before, and Helen wondered aloud why they would start now when humanity had only been in space for 40 years, and they were hardly the strongest species in the galaxy. Martin nodded, and explained that was exactly why the attacks had begun, because humans were relatively new and their territory was expanding, and they had a reputation for being helpful, and the Velcrin thought this made them easy marks and easy prey. Helen said coldly that the aliens had thought wrong, and she gave orders for a full intelligence workup on Velcrin operations, including every ship and every base and every supply line, and she wanted Martin to coordinate with the other fleets and warn every human vessel about this tactic. She declared that no one would respond to a distress call alone anymore, and they would go in pairs at minimum with weapons powered and ready, and Martin asked about the Velcrin ship that the Guardian had disabled, and Helen learned it was still drifting in the Kepler sector. The Velcrin government claimed it was a rogue element acting without authorization, but they had not sent anyone to recover the crew or the ship, and Helen decided that if the aliens would not retrieve their people, then humans would do it, and she wanted survivors questioned and the ship torn apart and analyzed. She wanted to know who gave the order for these attacks, and she wanted to understand the full scope of the operation. And 3 days later, the ESS Intrepid arrived at the coordinates and found the Velcrin warship exactly where the Guardian had left it, broken and scarred and venting frozen atmosphere. Lieutenant Commander Ben Cooper led the boarding team with Marines in powered armor, sweeping through the darkened corridors with weapons raised and ready, and they found 12 Velcrin survivors huddled in a sealed compartment with their supplies dwindling and their earlier bravado completely gone. The Velcrin captain looked small and defeated under the harsh lights of the interrogation room, and his name was Cyrix, and his scales were dull, and his movements were slow as he sat across from Admiral Helen Carter in the secure facility beneath Fleet Command headquarters. Helen asked simply why they had targeted rescue vessels, and Cyrix was quiet for a long moment before he finally spoke, and said that it worked. And throughout the galaxy, mercy was rare, and most species left each other to die because they competed and fought and survived, but humans were different. He explained that humans helped even their enemies, and the Velcrin thought this made them weak and easy targets. And Helen asked how many ships his vessel had attacked using this method, and Cyrix admitted that his ship alone had attacked 6 vessels. But there were others, and the number was in the dozens and maybe more. Helen felt ice flowing through her veins as she asked if this was organized, and Cyrix admitted in a whisper that it was a coalition, and the Velcrin were working with the Krathor and the Silene merchants, and these were species that profited from chaos, and they shared information about which routes humans patrolled and which ships were most likely to respond to distress calls. He said it was efficient, and Helen snapped back that it was murder, and they were killing people who came to save them. And Cyrix met her gaze and said yes, and it had worked until Commander Morrison saw through the trap and everything changed. Helen asked why he was telling her this, and Cyrix explained that he had no choice because his government would not ransom him, and the coalition would not rescue him, and he was dead either way. But perhaps if he cooperated, she would make his end quick instead of leaving him in a cell for decades. Helen stood and walked to the window, looking out at the military complex below where soldiers trained and ships prepared for launch, and humanity's defensive perimeter grew stronger every day, and she told Cyrix without turning around that he would tell them everything. She wanted every name and every ship and every planned attack, and she wanted him to help them dismantle the entire operation, and Cyrix asked what would happen if he cooperated, and Helen said that maybe he would see his homeworld again someday. But that was a long way off in the future. Over the following weeks, Cyrix provided information that intelligence verified and cross-referenced with their existing data, and the picture that emerged was worse than anyone had feared, and the predatory coalition had been targeting rescue operations across a dozen species and not just humans, and they had killed thousands and profited from salvaging the wreckage. Helen stood before the Unified Earth Council presenting her findings and her recommendations, and she told them that this coalition had declared war on the principle of mutual aid, and they had weaponized decency and made it dangerous to show compassion, and humanity could not let that stand. Counselor Patricia Green asked what the Admiral was proposing, and Helen said they needed a task force that would be multi-species if possible, but human-led if necessary, and they would hunt down every ship and every organization involved in these attacks and make an example that would echo through history. She explained that they would also establish new protocols for rescue operations that would protect both the rescuers and legitimate vessels in genuine distress, and another counselor cautioned that some would say they were overreacting and being driven by emotion rather than strategy. Helen agreed that some would say that, but they would be wrong because this was not about emotion, but about establishing that certain lines could not be crossed, and if they let this continue, they would doom every future rescue operation and make space more dangerous for everyone. The vote was unanimous, and 2 weeks later, Task Force Sentinel assembled in orbit above Mars with 15 warships ranging from frigates to the heavy cruiser ESS Retribution, and they prepared to deploy on a mission to find the predators and eliminate them. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the Guardian's bridge again, but this time his ship was part of something larger, and his tactical display showed the entire task force in formation, like a deadly constellation of human engineering and determination. Amy Crawford had been promoted to full lieutenant and given the position of communications chief for the task force, and she reported that all ships were ready, and Admiral Carter's voice came through on the command channel, speaking to the entire assembled fleet. The Admiral said they were the response to an attack on civilization itself, and they were the consequence for those who thought mercy was weakness, and they would find the predators and stop them and send a message that would protect every ship and every person who sailed the stars with good intentions. The task force's engines flared simultaneously, and 15 ships leaped into the darkness hunting for predators who had forgotten that humans, for all their compassion, had never stopped being apex predators themselves, and the hunt had begun in earnest. The ESS Retribution emerged from faster-than-light travel on the edge of the Kepler sector, and its sensor arrays immediately began sweeping the area, and Captain Daniel Price stood at the command station watching data populate his tactical display. Lieutenant Sophie Drake announced contact from the sensor station, and she said the bearing was 273 Mark 6, and the configuration matched the profile for a Velcrin-disguised warship, and they designated it as Target Alpha. Daniel asked about distance, and Sophie reported 40,000 kilometers and the enemy had not detected them yet, and Daniel smiled coldly because the Retribution carried new stealth systems designed specifically for this operation with passive sensors only, and minimal emissions. The hull was coated with materials that absorbed rather than reflected scanning waves, and they were a ghost among the stars. And Daniel broadcast on the encrypted channel telling the Guardian and the Defiance to move to intercept positions, while the Sentinel and Valiant covered the exit vectors. 4 ships acknowledged and began moving into position silently, and the Velcrin warship continued its patrol completely unaware that it was being surrounded by human vessels, and Sophie reported that the target was broadcasting a distress signal, claiming engine failure and requesting immediate assistance. Daniel muttered that it was not very original and asked if anyone was responding, and Sophie said negative because this sector had been cleared by civilian traffic control, and everyone now knew to stay away from suspicious signals. Admiral Carter's warning had spread throughout human space and beyond, and legitimate emergencies now required verification protocols with real-time video feeds and authentication codes, and ships in actual distress had to submit to scanner verification before help would arrive. Sophie said the target was altering course and moving toward the transit lane, and she thought they were looking for new hunting grounds, and Daniel decided they would introduce themselves, and he ordered all ships to power up on his mark with full weapons authorization. He said they would give the Velcrin one chance to surrender and only one chance, and the seconds ticked down as the alien ship drifted closer to the invisible net surrounding it, and Daniel gave the mark command. 5 human warships blazed to life, simultaneously with their reactors surging to full power, and their weapon systems locking onto the target, and the space around the Velcrin vessel suddenly filled with active targeting beams and missile locks. Daniel's voice boomed across all frequencies, identifying himself and Task Force Sentinel, and telling the Velcrin warship that they were surrounded and outgunned, and they had 30 seconds to power down their weapons and prepare to be boarded. Through the viewport, Daniel watched the alien ship's lights flicker in what might have been surprise or fear, and for 15 seconds nothing happened, and then the Velcrin ship's weapons ports opened, and plasma cannons began charging for battle. Daniel ordered all ships to fire calmly, and the Retribution's main railgun spoke first, launching a 60-centimeter slug of depleted uranium, accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed, and it struck the Velcrin ship's forward shields and punched through them like they were paper. The projectile continued through the hull and through the reactor compartment and out the other side, leaving a perfectly cylindrical tunnel of destruction, and the other ships added their firepower with missiles and lasers and kinetic weapons, converging on the target from multiple angles. The Velcrin warship tried to maneuver and tried to return fire, but it was hopeless, and within 40 seconds, the ship was a drifting wreck, venting plasma and debris into the void, and Daniel commanded ceasefire. Over the next 6 weeks, Task Force Sentinel systematically dismantled the predatory coalition vessel by vessel, and using information from captured prisoners and their own intelligence gathering, they tracked down 15 more disguised warships scattered across multiple sectors. Commander Morrison and the Guardian intercepted a Krathor vessel that had been posing as a damaged freighter near the outer rim, and when the aliens refused to surrender, Morrison's crew disabled their engines and weapons with surgical precision, leaving them adrift but alive for interrogation. The ESS Defiance, commanded by Captain Laura Bennett, cornered two Silene ships operating together in a coordinated ambush pattern, and the battle was brief and brutal, with one Silene vessel destroyed when it attempted to ram the Defiance, and the other surrendered immediately after watching its companion die. Each victory added valuable data to Task Force Sentinel's growing intelligence database, and they learned about supply routes and communication networks and the financial backers who profited from the Coalition's piracy operations, and the web of corruption stretched farther than anyone had initially suspected. Admiral Carter monitored the operation from Fleet Command, coordinating with other species governments, and the galactic community was slowly waking up to the scope of the problem, and some species offered support, while others quietly thanked humanity for doing what they should have done themselves. Lisa Grant reported one morning that they had received a communication from the Velcrin High Council, and it was an official request for a meeting, and Helen asked what terms they wanted to discuss, and Lisa said they did not specify, but reading between the lines, she thought they wanted the humans to stop hunting their ships. Helen said flatly that they would stop when there was no one left to hunt, but she would hear what the aliens had to say, and she told Lisa to arrange the meeting, and 3 days later, Helen found herself in a neutral diplomatic station orbiting a minor world. Across the negotiating table sat 3 Velcrin officials with their scales muted in the artificial light, and the lead diplomat began by saying they appreciated Admiral Carter taking this meeting, but Helen interrupted and told them to skip the pleasantries. She said their people had been murdering rescue vessels for months or maybe years, and they had declared war on compassion itself, and she asked what terms they could possibly offer that would interest her, and the Velcrin diplomat's pupils contracted in what might have been fear or anger. The diplomat said they acknowledged that certain elements within their society had acted improperly, and they were prepared to surrender those individuals for justice, and they were also prepared to pay reparations to the families of victims. Helen repeated the word improperly with cold contempt and said it was an interesting word for calculated mass murder, and the diplomat tried to explain that the Coalition was never official Velcrin policy, and it was just criminal elements. But Helen cut him off again. She said they had evidence, including communications that showed Velcrin intelligence services knew exactly what was happening, and supply records that showed their military providing weapons and equipment, and she told them not to insult her by pretending this was just a few rogue actors. The 3 Velcrin exchanged nervous glances, and the lead diplomat tried again, asking what Helen would have them do, because the humans had already destroyed or captured 23 of their vessels and killed hundreds of their people, and he asked when the revenge would end. Helen said coldly that this was not revenge, but consequence, and the Velcrin had established the rules of engagement when they faked their first distress call, and humanity was simply following through, and she explained that it would end when every ship involved in these attacks was eliminated. She continued saying it would end when every person who gave orders was in custody, and when the Velcrin government publicly acknowledged its role and instituted reforms to ensure it never happened again, and the diplomat protested that she was asking them to humiliate themselves before the galaxy. Helen stood and said she was asking them to take responsibility, and there was a difference, and she told them they had 1 week to comply with humanity's demands, and after that the humans would consider their government complicit and expand operations accordingly. She left the Velcrin diplomats sitting in stunned silence, and 5 days later, the Velcrin High Council issued a formal statement acknowledging that government officials had been aware of the Coalition's activities and had failed to act. They surrendered 32 individuals for prosecution and agreed to pay reparations totaling 200 billion credits, and they broadcast a message across all known channels saying that faking a distress call was now punishable by death under Velcrin law. The statement continued that any vessel caught attempting such a tactic would receive no protection or support from their government. And it was not everything Helen had wanted, but it was a significant start and a clear message to others. Lisa informed Helen that they were receiving reports from the other Coalition species, and the Krather and Selene were issuing similar statements, claiming they were shutting down their operations, and Helen asked if Lisa believed them. Lisa said she believed some of it because the Velcrin had been hit hard enough to learn a real lesson, but the others were hedging and trying to save face while quietly continuing operations in more careful ways. Helen decided that Task Force Sentinel would continue until they were satisfied the threat was completely eliminated, and it took another month of hunting, but eventually the attacks stopped completely, and the last confirmed coalition vessel was destroyed by the Guardian. The final enemy ship had ignored warnings and opened fire on a civilian transport, and Commander Morrison's crew showed no mercy in response. And when Task Force Sentinel finally returned to Earth, they found something unexpected waiting for them in orbit. Ships from a dozen species lined their approach vector, not as threats but as an honor guard, and humans were not the only ones who had been targeted by the coalition, and other species wanted to show their gratitude for what humanity had accomplished. Admiral Carter stood on the observation deck of Mars Station, watching the warships return home, and Captain Price approached and stood beside her, saying quietly that they had made an example, and the galaxy knew now that attacking humans who were trying to help was a fatal mistake. Helen replied that it was good, and maybe it would make space a little safer for everyone, but she knew the truth in her heart, that there would always be predators and always be someone willing to weaponize decency for profit, and the battle was not truly over, but just paused. 6 months after Task Force Sentinel returned to Earth, Commander Jake Morrison found himself in an unexpected position, teaching at the Fleet Academy, and Admiral Carter had personally requested his presence as a guest instructor, focusing on tactical decision-making and threat assessment. Jake told a class of 30 cadets that the simulation they were about to experience was based on a real incident, and they would be commanding a patrol frigate when they received a distress call, and their decisions would determine whether they lived or died. The cadets looked eager and nervous, and Jake remembered that feeling from his own youth, and it seemed like a lifetime ago now, and he ordered the simulation to begin, and the training center dimmed as holographic displays activated around each cadet's station. The cadets made their choices, with some approaching cautiously with weapons ready, while others rushed in to help exactly as the enemy had hoped, and by the end of the simulation, 12 cadets had been destroyed by the ambush, while 18 survived, though several were heavily damaged. Jake commanded reset and the holograms faded, and he told them they would discuss what happened, and one cadet named Rebecca Hayes raised her hand and said she had approached with weapons powered and shields up, but still lost half her crew. She asked what she had done wrong, and Jake assured her that she had not done anything wrong, because sometimes even when people made the right choices, others still died, and that was the reality they all faced. He explained that the question was whether she had given her crew the best chance of survival, and whether she had considered all the evidence before making her decision, and Rebecca said she thought she had, and Jake told her then she had done her job. Another cadet named Kevin Foster spoke up, asking if this made them paranoid, because if they questioned every distress call, would they not let real people die? And it was a good question that Jake had wrestled with himself many times. Jake admitted, yes, there was a balance they had to strike, and the new protocols helped with authentication codes and video verification and sensor sweeps, but Kevin was right, that they risked becoming so cautious that they failed to help those who genuinely needed assistance. Jake explained that judgment mattered, and that was why they trained constantly, and he pulled up a holographic display showing recent rescue operations and told them that since the coalition was dismantled, they had responded to 47 legitimate emergencies. He said 47 times human ships arrived to find people who truly needed help, and they saved lives because they were willing to take calculated risks, and he continued saying they had also identified and avoided 12 fake distress calls. Those were 12 times where someone tried to use human compassion against them, and the difference was that now they were smart about helping others, and they helped, but they were not stupid about it, and the class continued for another hour with Jake walking them through various scenarios. When it ended, Rebecca approached him and asked if she could ask something personal, and Jake said sure, and she asked if he ever regretted destroying that Velcrin ship, because they were still living beings, even if they were trying to kill him. Jake looked at the young cadet, seeing in her the same idealism he had once possessed, and he chose his words carefully, saying that he regretted it was necessary, and he regretted that sentient beings chose to pervert a fundamental principle of civilization. He said he did not regret stopping them because they made their choice when they faked that distress call, and they made their choice when they opened fire on a ship that came to help them, and all he did was respond to those choices. Rebecca nodded, slowly saying she understood, and Jake told her he hoped she never had to make that decision herself. But if she did, she should remember that protecting the innocent included protecting those who were willing to help the innocent. He said sometimes the most merciful thing anyone could do was ensure the predators could never hunt again, and Rebecca thanked him and walked away, thinking about his words, and Jake watched her go, hoping the next generation would be wiser than his own. His communicator buzzed, and it was a message from Admiral Hughes, saying a new assignment was available, and it was Deep Space Patrol in Sector 9 with long duration and high risk, and the message asked if he was interested. Jake smiled because teaching was important, but it was not who he truly was, and out there beyond Earth's protective embrace was where he belonged, and he typed his response asking when he would leave. The answer came back immediately saying tomorrow, and the Guardian would launch at 0800 hours and welcoming him back. And Jake closed the communicator, taking one last look at the training center before walking out. 8 months after, Task Force Sentinel's triumphant return. The ESS Guardian cut through the darkness of deep space with its newly upgraded sensors, sweeping a region designated as Sector 9, and Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge, comfortable in his role. Once more, Chris Palmer reported they were approaching the coordinates Admiral Hughes had specified, and nothing was showing on sensors yet, and Jake nodded while studying the star chart displayed before him. Sector 9 was frontier space barely explored, and sitting at the edge of human territory, and intelligence suggested that remnants of the coalition might have fled here, but so far the region seemed completely empty, and Jake ordered them to maintain alert status. He said just because they did not see anything did not mean they were alone out here, and Amy Crawford, now sporting an additional stripe on her uniform, glanced up from her station, saying she was picking up a faint signal. Jake asked what was strange about it, and Amy explained it was not a standard distress call, but more like a data burst with mathematical sequences and repeating patterns, and it did not match any known communication protocol. Jake felt his instincts prickle and asked about the source, and Amy said the bearing was 185, Mark 12, approximately 2 light hours distant, and Chris observed that was deep in uncharted space with no known colonies or stations. Jake said that meant whoever was sending it did not want to be found easily, or it was a trap designed for curious explorers, and he asked Amy if she could decode any of it, and she said she was working on it. For the next 3 hours, Amy and her team worked to decipher the signal while the Guardian cautiously approached its source, and Jake ordered the ship to stealth configuration, reducing emissions, and relying on passive sensors only. Amy finally announced she had decoded it and said it was a warning beacon telling ships to stay away from this region, and Jake asked what the warning was about, and Amy said that was the interesting part. The message included coordinates and mentioned something called the Remnant, and she paused before adding that part of the message was in Velcrin language, and Jake's jaw tightened as he ordered battle stations and full readiness. He said if this was what he thought it was, then they were walking into the lion's den, and Chris finished his thought saying the coalition survivors, and Jake confirmed exactly that, and the Guardian continued forward with every sensor strained to maximum sensitivity. They detected a small asteroid cluster ahead, dense enough to hide multiple ships, and Amy reported she was reading power signatures and multiple vessels trying to mask their emissions, and the configuration matched Velcrin warships with at least 6 of them. Jake said quietly that these were the ones who got away, and the ships that went dark before Task Force Sentinel could find them, and he asked for orders, and Jake considered his options carefully. They could retreat and report the finding and wait for reinforcements, which was the safe play and the smart play, but it would give the Remnant time to scatter again and disappear into the vastness of space. Jake told Chris to plot an exit course because if this went wrong, he wanted to be able to run, and he told Amy to prepare a data packet with everything they had learned because if they did not make it out, that information needed to reach Fleet Command. Chris protested that they were 1 ship against 6 and the odds were terrible, but Jake interrupted saying the odds were better than they seemed because they had surprise and superior technology, and the enemy did not know they had been found. He added that the Velcrin were hiding, which meant they were scared and scared enemies made mistakes, and he activated the ship-wide communication system telling all hands they had located hostile forces. He explained these were remnants of the coalition that attacked them months ago, and they were hiding because they knew what happened when they faced humans directly, and today they would be reminded why they should be afraid. The Guardian shook off its stealth configuration like a predator revealing itself, and power surged through the ship's systems, and weapons came online with a sound like rolling thunder, and Jake ordered a message broadcast on all frequencies. He identified himself and told the Velcrin vessels that they had tried to hide and tried to run, but Earth did not forget, and they had one chance to power down their weapons and surrender peacefully. He said if they refused, then the humans would finish what Task Force Sentinel started. And for a moment there was only silence in the void, and then the asteroid cluster erupted with violent activity. 6 Velcrin warships burst from their hiding places with weapons hot and engines flaring, and Jake muttered, "Here we go," and ordered evasive pattern Delta, and told Amy to activate the full electronic warfare suite. The Guardian twisted through space, as the first volley of plasma fire seared past and the Velcrin ships spread out trying to surround the lone human vessel, but Jake had anticipated this tactic perfectly. He ordered them to target the lead ship and fire the railgun, and the Guardian's primary weapon spoke, and one Velcrin warship took the hit on its forward shields, and the shields held but barely, and Jake commanded them to launch missiles in a spread pattern. 12 missiles erupted from the Guardian's tubes, each following a different trajectory, and the Velcrin ship scrambled to intercept them, and their point defense systems destroyed 10 missiles, but 2 got through, slamming into different targets. Amy warned that the enemy was coordinating their fire, and multiple targeting locks were on the Guardian, and Jake told Chris to bring them directly between the 2 ships on the left at full speed. The Guardian's engines howled as it accelerated toward the gap between 2 Velcrin vessels, and both ships fired simultaneously with their plasma bolts converging on where the Guardian should have been, but Chris was already executing a hard roll. The human ship slipped past as the enemy fire struck the opposite vessels instead, and Amy reported with satisfaction that 2 were disabled because they had just shot each other, and Jake said 4 remained, and told them to keep moving through the chaos.